All right, thanks again for joining me for the third in our series called Behind the Belly Button. Today we're going to talk about the microbiome and take a sneak peek into the astounding systems and the science of the gut. And this whole series is really designed to take a deeper dive into all the complex functions and systems that go on in our gut, because a healthy gut impacts nutrient absorption, hormones, immunity, hunger, and of course our genetic makeup as well. So this series of classes sheds a light on how all of these puzzle pieces work together. We start from kind of a broader understanding of the digestive system and then work our way down to drill down into a little bit more detail and then sort of other elements that come into play. So no worries if you've missed the first couple classes. We taught digestion and nutrient absorption as well as gut health. You don't need to have those as a precursor to benefit from today's class, but they're both actually recorded and available on our Wellness Classes website. And again, this one will also be made available. So after today, over in the next several months in April and then as well as in early summer, we'll be covering epigenetics, which takes a look at how genes play a role in our health, as well as the environment, our behavior, and these can all cause changes and affect how our genes work. So even though we can't change our DNA, epigenetics can now show us that how our DNA is expressed can really be affected by our behavior and our exposure to other variables. And then we'll also be talking about hunger because, quite frankly, we're all very familiar with hunger, but it can actually be triggered in a variety of ways and for different reasons. So feeling hungry may not mean that we are actually physically hungry. Our senses can trigger our brain, our emotions, trigger a need to eat, but that doesn't mean we're actually really hungry for food. So we'll learn about the different ways our body and brain experience hunger and then the strategies to assess whether and when and what to eat. So those will be coming up soon. Now for today's class, we'll be talking about why it's essential to feel good and to be healthy and how that's all intertwined and interconnected. We'll review some basics and definitions. As a review, if you've seen the other classes and if you haven't, no worries. This will give you a baseline. And then we'll talk about the superhero bacteria, our microbiome and our microbiota and that ecosystem that lives in our gut and how to maintain a healthy and balanced microbiome. So in daily life, we may not even realize how often we refer to our gut. We do this in a variety of ways, maybe not even noticing it. So we say things like, we went with our gut instinct, or you had a gut feeling or a gut reaction. We might experience butterflies in our stomach or get that sinking feeling. And this connection to the physiological responses in our gut, as well as the emotional ones, are very much rooted in science. And so behind and beyond the experiences and feelings we identify in our daily lives, gut health is so much more. So this is a really new and very exciting science. There's a lot we don't know, and scientists are in the very early stages of unraveling all the mysteries and the enormous implications in our health. It's something to keep in mind as we talk about everything that we're discovering. This has happened over the last few decades, but the last few decades in science, quite frankly, is new, right? So the studies show that there is strong evidence that gut health impacts not only digestive health, which, that's pretty normal to assume, right? But immunity, brain and heart health, obesity, emotional health and mood, cancer, autoimmune disorders, skin conditions, endocrine disorders. And if you're feeling like it's basically like, wow, pretty much everything, I would argue that yes, I would argue that this list actually goes on. So everything is interconnected. We talk a lot about this in our well-being classes, right? That it's not just about eating well and exercising, but in order to have a physically and mentally healthy body and to experience a true quality of life, successful management of these multiple factors has to be cultivated, and they are really interconnected with one another. So when you experience one factor out of balance, we may experience poor health in a variety of other ways that present themselves differently, right? So in the middle of all this is gut health. There's an interconnected relationship between it and sleep and stress and mental health and genetics, and the arrows would really point in both directions. So for example, getting enough sleep helps fight off infection, but it can also help improve mood and reduce stress. We also know that if we're not managing stress, that will in turn affect our sleep, our mental health, and our immune system. So sure, a healthy digestive tract depends on genetics somewhat, or to a certain extent, I would say. But scientists also believe that some people possess genes which create an imbalanced state in the gut that can lead to certain health conditions. So we'll explore this epigenetic, the genetic piece of this in the next class. As I mentioned, we just want to keep that in mind because what we're talking about today is sort of rewriting the script for some of our genetic code with our behaviors. Let's see. So researchers now know that the most basic and important level to maintain all of these interconnected factors is to create a balanced gut microbiome. All right, so let's review some of the basics here that were presented in the two previous classes. That'll help us get a higher level overview. Our body needs food and fuel, right, to run properly, much like a car. A car needs gas to run, car needs maintenance, right? You want to change the tires, you got to get the oil changed. Well, our bodies need important nutrients and they need energy to perform organ functions and to maintain health, but we can't use, a sandwich as is or a coffee as is to use these nutrients and energy. They're not immediately available to us. So the digestive tract processes the food and the liquids into these forms that our body can use. So if you take a look at how the digestive tract looks here, you'll see that it actually begins in the mouth, where we ingest food and liquids, and we'll travel down here into the stomach. Now, what we're going to be talking about primarily is these series of purple squiggles. This is our small intestine, and then our colon here, where the substances travel and then are excreted through the body. So most nutrient absorption occurs right here in the small intestine. It's actually about 20 feet long when unraveled, of course, depending on your size. The long length is really about creating surface area to allow for optimal absorption of the vitamins, minerals, reduced forms of carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. If you actually want to unravel this very long tube, it is actually the size of a tennis court, and the large intestine about the size of a small bathroom. So I pause here for dramatic effect, right? That's pretty cool. So by the sheer surface size alone, we can see how complex the process is. There's a complicated symphony of hormones and enzymes and bacteria that make it all come together. And then the enzymes and the bacteria are really what we're going to talk about today. So as we take a deeper dive here into the small intestine, if we create a cross-section of the small intestine, we see that this is a tube made up of multiple layers of muscle that contract, and that's how the substance moves through the digestive tract. And then here we've got a series of hair-like projections called villi. And here's our villus, here's one, right? And then these are little microvilli. So we have even more tiny little hair-like projections. And this is what happens. These shapes are how the surface area is increased in the gut to better absorb those nutrients into the body. So we're going to take a little closer look here. Here is our villi, and our little microvilli here. This is the inside of our intestine, and this is the circulatory system. So these are our intestinal lining here. Now, when the cells are damaged, they can't perform their job, right? In this healthy junctions here on the left, you'll see that the villi, the cells are attached tightly. So the items, the substances that are in our intestinal tract, only the healthy good stuff that needs to travel to our circulatory system to the rest of our organs is allowed to pass through and into the circulatory system. Now, when they are damaged, this causes spacing within that cellular wall. So anything that is produced here, whether they're good or bad substances, can cross into the circulatory system and lead to damage in the bodies. So what we're doing is allowing the good stuff our body needs, along with the toxins and other waste that we wouldn't want and other dangerous compounds, to cross that lining and enter the body. And this is called leaky gut. We'll talk about that in a little while, but leaky gut essentially promotes disease because our body is being inundated with this stuff we don't want. So as a specific example, there is a dangerous substance called TMAO. And it's produced in the intestine, and through leaky gut, it enters the bloodstream and it wreaks havoc on the cardiovascular system. So this TMAO specifically is associated with a higher risk of heart failure, or those that are already in heart failure, I guess making that more rapid. But this is a result of an imbalanced ecosystem in the gut called the microbiome. All right. So microbiomes themselves are everywhere. They're basically ecosystems made up of bacteria, parasites, and microbes. They're in dirt, they're in other animals, they're in other organs in the human body, the mouth, female genitalia, the skin. These are all various different ecosystems. And today we're going to be focusing just on the gut microbiome itself. So let's take a moment here to watch a very simple video.
It's in you. It's all over you. It is you. Your body consists of an entire ecosystem of diverse and helpful little bacteria, more than 100 trillion of them. This is the human microbiome, and it means that we each have a troop of good bacterial superheroes to call our own. Did you know that the greatest concentration of bacterial superheroes lives in your gut? This ecosystem of microorganisms is a huge part of who you are. Your microbiome aids in food digestion to fuel your body, influences your mood and energy levels, helps you adapt to your surroundings to protect against harmful organisms, and much, much more. Scientists have only just scratched the surface of understanding how incredible these little guys truly are and how important they are to our health. It all started when you were born. Some of the bacteria in your mother's microbiome were passed along to you to become the beginnings of your very own microbiome fingerprint. When you were a baby, experiencing the world for the first time, the bacteria in your microbiome were doing the same. By the time you were a toddler, the makeup of your gut microbiome was almost fully matured. At 2 or 3 years of age, your bacterial superheroes had already established a natural, balanced state. Did you know that diversity is the key to a healthy microbiome? In a forest with only one kind of tree, what would happen if a beast came along and ate up all the leaves? All the creatures in the forest would be affected. In the same way, diversity is also needed in the bacteria of your gut. Scientists have discovered that your microbiome fingerprint actually needs to consist of many different types of bacteria to keep you strong, healthy, and resilient to drastic or harmful changes. Did you know that a healthy microbiome likes balance? When your microbiome becomes unbalanced, you may become unhealthy and even susceptible to chronic disease. But with the help of your superheroes, your microbiome always strives to return to a natural, balanced state. Eating pre- and probiotics can help your superheroes to be more effective in keeping you healthy. Your microbiome plays a starring role when it comes to this. From digesting food, to affecting mood and energy levels, to preventing invasions by bad microorganisms, your superheroes are working hard to keep your gut healthy every minute of every day. The Canadian Digestive Health Foundation wants you.
All right, pretty neat, right? So as the video said, we're looking for a balance of good and bad bacteria. You've got so much bad bacteria, you have an unhappy microbiome, you have an unhappy intestinal tract, and you've got plenty of good stuff, and you've got a happy microbiome. And the changes really depend on a variety of different factors in terms of what that's made up of. Now, in addition to this balance of good and bad bacteria, we've got an overwhelming majority of our genetic makeup, our DNA, that lives in the microbiome. It is thought that about 90% of our DNA and our genetic makeup is actually located in the gut, more than any other organ in the body. And we have a unique footprint. So yours looks very different than mine, right? It is because our microbiome footprints are so unique that research is really complicated. So due to these individual differences from person to person, it's difficult to set clear definition of what a healthy microbiome looks like. There's no single combination of an optimal microbiome. There's an infinite number of variations, but regardless, research now shows that despite variability over and over, there are clear groups of good and bad microbes. In one recent study, it was actually an international study, fairly large scale, researchers found that a clear association between specific microbes, certain foods, and risk for common disease. So they also found that microbiome-based biomarkers for obesity, cardiovascular disease, impaired glucose tolerance, diabetes, again, endocrine disorders, everything that we've mentioned up to this point. So specific strains of bacteria, lack thereof, or too much of, show us some clear associations with these disorders. So based on this knowledge, what does that really mean? So for example, in cardiovascular disease, since doctors or researchers are able to identify certain biomarkers for cardiovascular disease, they can be identified well before any symptoms are present. So as far as prevention, doctors can prescribe a specific diet to reverse inflammation long before the individual develops heart problems. And those are huge implications for disease prevention. Now, again, I remind you, this is really early research, so I can't speak to how many cardiologists out there or primary care physicians are doing this. I'm going to say probably not that many. But the gut ecosystem, here's how it works. The bacteria compete for real estate. So like all bacteria, good bacteria grows in the right conditions with the right food and the environment, but so does bad bacteria, right? It multiplies many times over. Hopefully it's balanced, and so the good bacteria, the microbiota, prevent unhealthy bacteria from growing. So they take up more of the real estate. If there's too much bad bacteria in the microbiome and the imbalance increases, this is what increases our disease risk. So some thrive in a hot, dry environment like skin, right? That's different. That's a different environment and a different set of microbiota than what is in our gut. So if you take a fern, for example, a fern is a plant that thrives in a dark, moist environment, forest climate. But if we planted it in the desert, it would certainly not thrive in this hot, dry environment. So think about the bacteria in the same way. And these ecosystem conditions, they sort of drive the microbe types that we find in that particular microbiome. And this is affected by diet, of course, genetics, a certain predisposition to certain types of microbes, more or less of one and another. Medication, this really affects the microbiome, and it could be for a short duration of time. So if you're on antibiotics for 2 weeks, right, those are supposed to kill bacteria. Well, they kill both good and bad bacteria. So that changes the microbiome. But if you have a chronic condition and are on long-term medication that affects the microbiome, well, then those are the implications for that. Now, the other thing we can't forget about is our environment, which is incredibly important because toxins that we ingest either through food or coming in contact with, the quality of the air, the quality of the water will also impact our microbiome. Now, it does change. Of course, our microbiome grows, as the video mentioned. So we are kind of a clean slate at birth. It depends on how we come into the world, right? So whether traditional birth or via C-section, the different microbiomes between the birth canal and skin are going to depend on what the child is exposed to first, whether that child was born in a hospital versus a home, who touched the baby, what the baby touches, right? So this is a state where the microbiome is really growing and evolving at the fastest rate. What the baby ingests as far as food also affects the microbiome, just like humans, but breast milk will have a different type of makeup than formula mixtures, right? So as we grow into later childhood and adulthood, this is where we find our baseline for our microbiome. We do have our unique footprint still. We've got variability across gender, across climate, where we live in the world, the hygiene situation, occupation, that can also impact our microbiome. And then as we grow into older age, we find that senior citizens create a distinct profile in their microbiome. So there are some species that are more and less common in older adults. So you'll see among older adults that they share more similarities in their microbiomes because those microbial populations become more alike as they get older. Now, these superheroes, this wonderful good bacteria, what do they do for us? Well, they produce important vitamins such as B and K, among others. They control metabolism and nutrient storage. So they create signals that prompt cells to store our energy or store our nutrients as energy or fat. They influence our body's response to insulin, right? This is important for diabetes and obesity. They help digest carbohydrates. They help release nutrients that would otherwise pass through the body without being absorbed. They're a chemical reaction that feeds good bacteria. These are our probiotics. They control blood pressure. They train our immune system. They actually stimulate the production of the pathogen-fighting antibodies that keep us healthy. They teach our system to attack invaders and then identify the good bacteria and leave those guys alone. They protect from infection and toxins. So they actually teach themselves how to defend themselves. They decrease inflammation, are really important in organ development, and they maintain tissue health and promote healing. So remember, our intestinal lining is a tissue, right? So this goes back to our leaky gut that we mentioned earlier. This is where they come into play, maintaining these tight connections in the intestinal wall that prevent all of the waste and toxins and the negative substances we wouldn't want coming into our body. So there are foods that support good bacteria. They include three kind of broad categories that you want to keep in mind. Number one, fiber. Fiber is key because carbohydrates, the process of breaking down healthy carbohydrates, good carbohydrates, promote the growth of good bacteria. So things like whole grains, barley, sourdough bread, sourdough bagels, brown rice, corn tortillas instead of flour tortillas. these help break down these compounds that produce these healthy or feed this healthy good bacteria. Now, the next category is plant-based foods. And this really is vegetables and fruit and legumes. And you sort of get this like 2-for-1 or 3-for-1 even with eating plenty of vegetables, because number one, they naturally can produce or contain rather a lot of fiber. So you sort of hit like 2 birds with 1 stone with getting the carbohydrates, and you're getting your antioxidants and so many other nutrients. And scientists are finding actually why plant-based foods. Scientists are finding that overconsumption of animal products like meat and eggs and dairy can actually lead to higher production of, in this one example we used before, substances like this TMAO, which in that one particular study show that higher consumptions of fish and eggs actually produce the specific substance, the TMAO, which then crossed into the bloodstream and increased the incidence of heart failure. So that's just one specific example. Now, you don't have to go completely plant-based unless you want to give it a try. Any reduction in animal products helps. For example, the Mediterranean diet, which includes a lot of vegetables, some whole grains, fruit, nuts, oils, and then you do eat some meat on that diet, but that's very much reduced. So any type of reduction in consumption of animal products is going to be of benefit. You don't have to go kind of all or nothing here. What else? Well, when you're eating vegetables, you can eat them fresh, you can eat them cooked, you can buy them frozen. Now, I would stay away from canned vegetables and canned fruit because they do contain a lot of sodium, and usually the syrup with the fruit has a ton of added sugar. Now, the other thing, be careful when you're purchasing frozen veggies. The ones that are actually seasoned and flavored also often have a lot of sodium. So I would just buy plain frozen veggies and then season them at home. Nuts, fats, and oils are also very beneficial, along with legumes, which if you're eating more plant-based, eating black beans and chickpeas and lentils are really important because they contain a ton of fiber, are a great source of protein, and really help the breakdown of the legumes, really helps in the production of this good bacteria. Now, the third category is fermented foods, and they're sort of in this special category of their own because they're extraordinarily powerful in feeding the body this healthy bacteria that we truly need. And fermented foods, I would say, have been around for quite a long time. It was one of the early food preservation methods, and fermented foods were a much more natural, larger part of a human diet that sadly has really changed a lot as we moved into the standard American diet, which involves a lot of processed food and quick food. So we don't tend to eat a lot of fermented food, which has had a huge negative impact really on microbiomes and gut health. Now, it's a process where yeast and bacteria convert all the carbohydrates, such as starch and sugar, into alcohol and acid. And this is why whole food, the carbohydrates, why I keep talking about fiber, is extremely important in our diet. So we need them to promote probiotic growth. This is naturally preserves the food. It gives us this distinct, zesty, tart taste. And these foods are actually more nutritious in their unfermented form. Fermented foods can help relieve digestive conditions, gas, diarrhea, and bloating, among other things. Fermented foods are also, they also produce melatonin, which, back to where everything is interconnected, right? A healthy microbiome helps us sleep better. So we get greater benefits from whole food sources rather than from processed food or supplements. So I think the goal here would be kind of working to maybe incorporate some more fermented foods from the whole food variety into your diet. understanding that supplementation, probiotic supplementation is not a bad thing, but also that fermented food doesn't always mean healthy. So there are some foods that are fortified with prebiotics and probiotics, but we really want to seek sources from whole food because some of these are high in fat, salt, and sugar. So case in point, if you've recently been to sort of the yogurt aisle, you'll see that a lot of that looks like dessert. But before we go on in that vein, let's watch a quick video on how we grow bacteria and how fermentation works.
Where does bread get its fluffiness, Swiss cheese its holes, and what makes vinegar so sour? These foods may taste completely different, but all of these phenomena come from tiny organisms chowing down on sugar and belching up some culinary byproducts. Let's start with yeast. Yeast are single-celled fungi used to make bread, beer, and wine, among other products. Yeast break down carbohydrates like sugar to get energy and the molecules they need to function. They have two different ways to do this, the oxygen-dependent or aerobic pathway and the oxygen-independent anaerobic pathway, which is also called fermentation. When you bake bread, yeast can use both pathways, but they normally prefer to start with the anaerobic process of fermentation. In this process, ethanol is produced in addition to CO2. No, bread isn't alcoholic. Small amounts of alcohol that are secreted evaporate during baking. In the aerobic or oxygen-dependent pathway, the yeast consumes some of the sugar and produce carbon dioxide gas, or CO2, and water. In both processes, the CO2 accumulates and creates tiny bubbles. These bubbles get trapped by gluten and create a sponge-like structure that gives the bread its soft texture. Wine also relies on yeast, but a winemaking setup keeps the oxygen levels low so that yeast consume sugar using fermentation, the anaerobic pathway. The process often starts with wild yeasts already hanging out on the grapes. But to get results, most winemakers also add carefully selected strains of yeast that can tolerate high levels of alcohol. The yeast consume the sugar in the grape juice, and as fermentation, the anaerobic pathway. The process often starts with wild yeasts already hanging out on the grapes. But to get consistent results, most winemakers also add carefully selected strains of yeast that can tolerate high levels of alcohol. The yeast consume the sugar in the grape juice, and as the sugar level drops, the alcohol level rises. This doesn't necessarily mean that sweeter wines have less alcohol. Different types of grapes start with different amounts of sugar, and sugar can also be added. What happens to the carbon dioxide? It just bubbles away through a vent. In carbonated alcoholic beverages like champagne and beer, sealed containers are used in primary or secondary fermentation to keep the carbon dioxide in the bottle. Wine also introduces us to our second type of food-producing microorganism, bacteria. A special strain of bacteria turns a tart compound in grape juice into softer tasting ones that are responsible for some of the flavors in red wines and Chardonnays. Another type of bacteria, called acetic acid bacteria, isn't so desirable in wine, but they have their function too. If there's oxygen around, these bacteria convert the ethanol in wine into, well, acetic acid. Let this process continue, and you'll eventually get vinegar. Bacteria are the key for cheese, too. To make cheese, milk is inoculated with bacteria. The bacteria gobble up the lactose, a kind of sugar, and produce lactic acid along with many other chemicals. As the milk gets more and more acidic, its proteins start to aggregate and curdle. That's why spoiled milk is clumpy. Cheesemakers usually add an enzyme called rennet, naturally found inside of cows, goats, and some other mammals, to help this process along. Eventually, those little curdles turn into bigger curds, which are pressed to squeeze out the water and create a firm cheese. Different strains of bacteria make different kinds of cheese. For example, a species of bacteria that emits carbon dioxide is what gives Swiss cheese its characteristic holes. Some cheeses, brie and camembert, use another kind of microorganism too, mold. So your kitchen functions as a sort of biotechnology lab, manned by microorganisms that culture your cuisine. Yogurt, soy sauce, sour cream, sauerkraut, kefir, kimchi, kombucha, cheddar, challah, pita, and naan. But maybe not all at the same dinner.
Here I am talking to you and I did not unmute myself. All right, so now we understand a little bit more about how fermentation works. Let's talk about prebiotics, which are actually food for probiotics. So we are back to our friends, carbohydrates, high fiber, fruits, veggies, seeds, and certain grains. Remember that whole food sources are always best. Some foods are fortified, bread, cereal, and yogurt. Now, these can really be, depending on the choice you make, end up being highly processed food. If you take a look at breads in your bread aisle, they're not all created equally. Some are much higher in fiber than others. Some have much more sugar than others. Cereal, right? It runs the gamut from unsweetened and with a lot of fiber to fairly processed. Yogurt, absolutely, a lot of them have a lot of sugar. But what you're going to look for in the ingredients to know whether a food is fortified is either oligosaccharides, fructooligosaccharides, galactooligosaccharides. Don't let these crazy long words make you nervous. Really what you're looking for is this oligo right here. It's in all the words. Saccharide really just means sugar. So this is fruit sugar. Galacto is pertaining to lactose, so dairy sugar. And then you can see here, we also have inulin and chicory root. So here we're looking at an ingredient label from a kashi cereal. And I know there's inulin in English muffins, in all kinds of foods. So you want to just look for those. Okay, so probiotics, if you're looking to supplement, that's completely fine. Just keep some things in mind. Safety is first, right? And common sense prevails. Check with your doctor, especially if you have a certain condition or taking certain medications. There are some conditions where you should not be taking certain strains of probiotic. Again, a reminder that because certain strains of bacteria are associated with specific conditions, when you go to the store, if you're taking it for general health, my suggestion is to just pick one for overall health. There's some for women's health and other specific digestive health, etc. So if you're new, start with a lower dose. That would be around 10 million CFU. Again, let's not overdo it, right? Our body are not really, if they're not used to a lot of probiotics or a lot of fiber, go slowly. It is going to take your body some time to acclimate. You might experience some other symptoms like gas or bloating for a little while. Your body will adjust. It's just important to know that you don't want to go too quickly and too much. Supplements are available both refrigerated and shelf stable. I don't know that there's really one preference over another. With refrigerated probiotics, you want to keep in mind that the reason they're being kept refrigerated is because they're live cultures and they would need to be refrigerated throughout the whole transportation process, which means that from manufacturer to airplane and truck and train or whatever they're transported on, they would need to be kept at the right temperature before they made it into that refrigerator in the grocery store. And there's really no way to really know if that's happened. So I'll just put that forth for your consideration. Just as different bacteria are associated with different benefits or health conditions. There are many that we're constantly learning about, 150 that we know so far. And here's some that surprised me a little bit that I hadn't really thought of. Dental health, kidney stones, anemia. It can help, they can help improve cholesterol, various cancers, and also reduce some allergies. Okay, so back to where everything is interconnected, right? There are other ways to support our gut. Getting enough sleep. I am going to make a plug for our Power of Sleep class. Now, Amy just did a 1 hour long condensed class called the Power of Sleep, the catnap version. And it is going to be available recorded on our Wellness Classes webpage as well. It is an abridged version of our 4-part class that we held several years ago, the A to Z Guide to Good Health, which is incredibly informative and eye-opening about why and how sleep affects our well-being. Of course, exercise and moving more makes us healthier overall, managing stress, and seeking treatment for anxiety and depression. We didn't really cover a whole lot in mental well-being in this section here, but it does come up quite a bit in our gut health class. So please take some time to watch that, because there's an incredibly strong connection between the two brains, our gut brain and our head brain, and emotional well-being, as well as the microbiome. Now, there are some actual test kits now. You can actually test your microbiome. They're in-home fecal test kits. Should you do one? Should you not do one? The jury's really still out. Like I said, this is really new science. So you want to think about what you want to glean from the test. What is it going to tell you? Is it informative? Is it something that you will be able then use to take action, right? One of the things that can be, if you think about the benefits of one, is that there's no clear definition of the right combination of microbiota, right? The doctors can't say, well, if you need X amount of this strain of bacteria for good cholesterol, and you have to have, no more than this type of bacteria for heart health or blood pressure or what have you, because it's so unique to each one of us. And remember, we're also looking at the uniqueness across a lifespan. So at different stages of life and environment, and those are they ebb and flow for all of us. We've got constantly changing ecosystems. So if you're on antibiotics, or depending on what you ate the day before, that microbiome test, the fecal test, will show a different sort of mix of the bacteria during that one specific time period. So you want to consider whether that window, that frame, is really a baseline for you. Really, I think it's important to keep in mind that the more variety we have of bacteria, the greater our health and well-being. The less diversity we have, the less healthy we are. So we're really trying to increase the diversity of our microbiome, rather than necessarily focusing so much on the types. Now, if you are suffering from a specific condition and you are looking at using improving the microbiome for that, then certainly digestive health or women's health or allergies or what have you, then you can certainly obviously do some research and speak with your doctor about those. All right, I am going to open this up to questions.